my own understanding of a caretaker,
matching at all.
most importantly, the people who take the services of caretakers should see the value in caretakers, because caretakers are a very important group of people in our society. We can't do without them. When you value them, you will get the best out of them.
A very good evening, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are watching. We're coming to you from different locations. We're trying to keep in line with the SOPs set by the Ministry of Health for COVID-19. So we're staying in our locations and meeting up online to have this conversation. And tonight we'll be speaking about unpaid care work at home. This particular show is done in collaboration with Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I'll quickly introduce my guests. I'll start with Masi Mundu, who is from Action Aid. She is the Program Manager, Democratic Governance. We have Assumpta Namaganda, who is a social vulnerability specialist. Assumpta has quite a profile, and most of her work is really in line with the conversation we're going to have today. She'll share a bit more. Then finally, we have Reverend Captain Gideon Muhima, who is from All Saints Cathedral. Reverend, it's good to have you as part of the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Right, so we'll just quickly get into our conversation. And I mentioned earlier that we'll be speaking about unpaid care work at home. Before we get into unpaid care work, I wanted us to understand the definition of care work. And I would like maybe Masi, you'll start us off. How would you define care work and all the types that there is of it?
Care work, in my opinion, and from where I sit, is really work done in service of others that is motivated by reasons other than money. And usually this is within the domestic setting, and it could be directly or indirectly. So directly meaning child care for the elderly, men and girls, although we also know a proportion of men are involved in unpaid care work. And then indirectly, especially communal activities that involve, rendering service that is not necessarily paid for.
Great, thank you, Masi. Assumpta, does your definition of care work differ from what Masi just shared with us, or are we speaking about the same thing?
Care workers would look at those caring for our elderly. Yes, she said it is in the domestic setting, but it may not necessarily be in the domestic setting, because now we are having nursing homes. Those nursing homes, the people that are working there, that is care work that they're providing, but they're not paid accordingly. It is considered, yes, you're providing a service because this is an elderly person, you need, society has to take care of them, but they're not paid accordingly. And then as for the domestic workers, yes, it is in the domestic setting, but they are undermined, they are underlooked, that, no, you're just cleaning. I can also do the cleaning work, only that I'm busy. My work requires me to be on duty. for some 12 or 13 hours. So you come in and take over that. So they are not appreciated accordingly.
Gideon, do you differ, or are we again still on the same page?
I would add that from my perspective, I think the key word is the service, and from a faith practice, especially in my leaning, my Christian leaning, the word that would come forward would be servanthood. A number of Christians who understand that word will begin to grapple with the entirety of what it actually means to be in unpaid care work. I think that in addition to what everyone has said, that would be the angle I will be going after, servanthood.
So we're going to focus this discussion. I noticed from Assumpta's definition that she went into both paid and unpaid care work, and we know and we all agree that there are those two sides to that. We're going to focus more on unpaid care work at home. And I wanted to understand from your different lenses, what do you see in Uganda? If you could help us paint the picture, what does unpaid care work look like?
Back in Uganda, these domestic workers are not regulated. They don't have a minimum wage. They don't know what terms and conditions they will work in. They'll just be there. Then when you look at caregivers, an individual is picked from either from the village as a relative, a distant relative, who's available at that time to come and help out, take care of the elderly, either the grandmother or the grandfather. They don't imagine that person will need to be remunerated, because she also has needs. All they will do is say, oh, that is your koja, that is your jaja. So since everyone calls her jaja, also you will even call her jaja, even when she's a very distant relative and you're not even related to them, either by blood.
You said that, and you left out when we give birth and we are looking for a relative to come and help us with the baby. You spoke about the elderly, and yet I know that a lot of us look for our relatives that we never pay to come and help us take care of our children.
It's impossible to say that you can't find, there won't be any point in time where relatives are going to be paid to care. It's inevitable that they care, because they will care for someone they love. They will care for someone they care for, and so it is not going to be. You won't ever find a system that is going to change that, where a mother is going to help her daughter deliver a baby for pay. That's almost immoral in our culture, especially. So the one thing that I have to embrace is that unpaid care work is going to remain unpaid for the better part of humanity. The day that changes, then we are going to have a completely different dynamic in society. And many would regard it as immoral, as a decadent society, where the payment is going to define how much care you're going to get from those that love you. That's going to be a very decadent society should that happen.
All right, I see Assumpta's hand up. Assumpta, you can come in and respond to Gideon. I'm sure you had something to say to him.
It's not going to be immoral in society, where the day we all recognize that everyone has to be paid for what is due to them. Because we look at a situation or at a situation where you say it's your mother. Yes, it's your mother. But we look at situations where you're just picking a relative, even if it's your sister, even if it's your brother. That person spending time at your home probably would be earning something. Is not just sit at home idle. And even then, that individual needs to survive in life. Let's look at a child you've picked at 18 years. What do you think the future of that child should be at 18 years? You bring her home, start raising your children until your children start school. This girl will be making probably 22, 24 years. She will need a future in her life. What do you have to do for them?
For a lot of people, there is the feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's the feeling that I've taken her from a worse situation, I've brought her here, there is free food, there are free meals, and all I'm asking in return is just a little help with, whatever roles, and they don't look beyond the fact that this person is going to be in your space for over a year or so on, and their whole life now revolves around you, and they basically don't have a life besides that.
She can develop or grow from that line where she was at in the village. But now let's look at when she provides you that service, what do you get to save as an individual? Me as a mother, I'll be able to put in more hours in the office and I'll be paid even overtime, while this girl is seated at home with my baby. So where do I put the overtime that has been given to me? This domestic worker has provided you that space. Even the woman, we are seeing now more women moving into higher positions in leadership or in management, all because of these people we call that are unpaid. If you can't afford to pay for that care, you don't have to have it.
If I am getting a relative from who I may not be as close to, the unpaid care work should be mutual in my view. That she's giving, or they are giving us help, but also I have to think from my end, what help can I give them? How can I support them without getting? It's a mutual give and take from that angle. If I am caring for my wife, right, especially for instance in this period, if she got COVID and I'm caring for her, am I going to ask for pay? And yet I have to do my work as well. I think that it can be defined when you look at the majority of people that do the unpaid care work, they're women, right? And the unpaid care work is usually done by mothers, by grandmothers, by daughters, and it is about the home. And so it is imperative for us to recognize that I can't even imagine how much I would have to pay them for them to do that. I mean, the work is priceless, what they are doing. And I think that is what society has done, has demeaned this work, devalued it, and equated their value. So that is why you have a patriarchal society that devalues women, because based on the work they give, they don't value it as much. And so from a point of view, I think that unpaid care work is not unpaid because it is mundane, it's because it's priceless. And that's the angle I am coming from. That servanthood is a priceless gift that one can give to the other to ensure that their work or their lifestyle is more sustainable.
You said something I'm going to come back to a little later, but I'm very certain Mercy wants to respond to the statements that you've just made. So Mercy, please come in.
When I look at unpaid care work, I look at it from an equality perspective. I look at it from an economic empowerment perspective. I also look at it from a women's rights perspective. What we're trying to say around unpaid care work specifically does not just apply to the fact that people are going to come and perhaps give you a helping hand in a particular situation, like what Reverend has just described, which is going to be temporary, and she's going to probably go back to the village. But if you look at, if you did a time survey, I usually do this when I'm training communities, where we do a time map. We plot how many hours a day men and women spend doing productive work. So we sort of just map out from 7 a.m. when a woman wakes up in a household, what does she do? And then a man maps out what they do ordinarily from 7 a.m. to perhaps midnight. And if you plot what women and girls do and what men and boys do, even if men did the plotting for women and boys did the plotting for girls, you realize that on average, women spend about 32 hours a day, just doing unpaid care work, meaning they're doing household chores. They are also doing care work, especially with children, with the elderly, with the sick, sometimes in communities, especially where there are funerals and all these cultural functions. You find women invested in those kinds of spaces. At the end of the day, you realize that women and girls especially then are not being compensated monetarily for that work. And as they invest these hours doing this work, by the way, their male counterparts are investing these hours in productive work. I've not yet even touched on the category of especially domestic workers that are doing work. They're doing, some of them are doing paid care work, but they're not paid according to the amount of time and resources that they invest in ensuring that families and communities are running. I haven't even come to that part, but I am just giving the basic relatable example of families. So you realize from the onset, there is always going to be a gender gap. There's always going to be a certain level of inequality. So there's certain work that is ring-fenced for women and girls. And unfortunately, this work takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, but it is not paid work. While on the other hand, men carry a lighter burden.
So from what I'm hearing you say, and also from what Gideon spoke about, there's a question there on are women, Mercy, when you point out that it's mostly the women doing the unpaid care work, are the women asking to be paid for this care work? Or, when Gideon looks at it and says there's a moral issue there, what are we looking for? Are we just saying the men should also participate, contribute, and do their share of that work that's at home, so that we both have to do our daily jobs and still have the same? But we'll talk about this a bit more when we return from this break. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. So we were speaking about whether or not women and girls and anybody else really that's doing some of this unpaid care work. So Gideon gave us an example of his mother-in-law. Should he be paying his mother-in-law? Would she even accept the payment for taking care of her daughter? Is the conversation really about payment, or is it more about everybody look at the roles on the table? How do we all ensure that these roles are done without one person being more burdened than the other?
There's a lot of confusion between gender roles and equality, and gender equality. And I think that as we grow in the understanding of these two, and remove the confusion, it becomes a lot more clear that the men have been a lot more lazy in especially the unpaid care work. We are lazy because either we have been given a view of it that makes us feel less of men or something along those lines. But the push to have the equality is not so that we are fighting each other or fighting the gender, or trying to demean the men, but to include them in this invaluable care work, priceless. I think that our view of this care work is what has been flawed, and therefore the reward systems have been flawed. But if we view it, if our minds are transformed to view it as priceless, as this is something that we value above any other kind of work, that we can't even give a pay to it, I think that would kind of give it a little more credence, especially for men to be engaged and to be partners with the women in the care work. And therefore that flows into it lessens the confusion between work and purpose.
I'm just curious to know what the church, for example, is doing in line with the things that you've just said about the kind of education that we need to be giving on this particular topic. But I'm going to ask you that question a little later on. Assumpta, I wanted you to come in at this point and maybe just speak to us.
I'm in support or in agreement with my sister, Mercy, what she said about gender equality. But my brother Gideon just gives it another dimension. When he turns it around, yes, we know that society should appreciate, we should know the society, uphold the society norms and culture, but we don't have to use them to make others seem like we use culture and norms to work against the others in society. When we look at a mother and a father, those are close relatives. But where you have to pick an individual, at least it would be fair enough that you say, at least let's save some money off, even if I have to pay you 40,000 or 50,000 as minimum, because this girl is not able to negotiate for her wages and she doesn't have any skill.
Thank you for sharing that. Mercy, I'm going to come to you. One of the things that we keep hearing from all of you, the panelists, is how most of this care work is going to be done by women. Women carry twice as much unpaid domestic and care work, including raising children, caring for the sick or elderly family members, managing the household and so on, than men do. And we know that they shoulder a disproportionate share of unpaid care work around the world. And we've spoken about the gender imbalances in the distribution of care work and so on. I wanted us to look at the consequences of this, and I'll come to you first, Mercy. When we think through what you've all just shared, what are the consequences of having this unpaid care work? What does it do for women on a daily in their lives?
You know that as long as you're investing hours of your life doing unproductive work, ultimately, then it has an implication in terms of where you fit within the poverty index. Actually, for me, the conversation on unpaid care work is just really, it's a contradiction of our political economy, because right now it is really evident that this is one of the most instrumental sectors, the care sector, even in the times like now, the COVID-19, and where the world is shifting now, this is one of the most essential sectors. And yet, the flip side of all of this is that despite the fact that it is one of the most instrumental sectors, we also realize that it's the most under-resourced, and the people that work within this sector are probably the least remunerated. So the gaps that we see in terms of poverty in our statistics has its root from this, the fact that a greater proportion of the population is women, but these women are not making any viable contribution to the economy, given the fact that much as they doing a lot of unpaid, a lot of care work, they're not being paid for it. Many times girls drop out of school simply because they can no longer balance. You cannot be coming from home and doing all of this work and go to class and concentrate. So many times they will not perform as well as their male counterparts. And that ultimately affects where they fit in the job market if they continue with school. And other times they will just be discouraged and drop off and perhaps get married, because for them, education then does not become an option for them. So all of these have far-reaching implications. And what we're saying is that the starting point is recognition and value. And by value, we mean that even if women are going to continue to do this work, and I speak about women fondly because women contributing 75% of the unpaid care work for me is a huge number. So I cannot run away. So you forgive me for making mention of women and girls. So that means that if we do not recognize and value this, first of all, by redistribution. Second of all, escalating it to how our policies are framed to recognize and value this in terms of, minimum wage, in terms of the countries that have laws that really tackle the issues of care.
In speaking about the consequences, you pointed out rather briefly to the education, and it takes me to what Assumpta was speaking about how we get people from the village. So you get a young girl and you're not thinking about, continuing with higher education, but also that then points to the kind of job she'll eventually get, if she gets one at all and is able to leave your compound. And if she eventually gets one, she's not getting paid here. How is she going to be able to speak up and ask for equal pay, or a pay that's worth the work that she's put in? Gideon, it would be nice to hear from you at this point.
I think, to base it on that, I think one of the biggest challenges that at least from my angle, I get to see is in the areas of decision making when women are not involved. There is a sense in which over time that has defined their identity, that they belong to the kitchen, that they belong to do the housework and to all these things. And so there has been a devalue, a sense there's no worth. There's not much worth given to women and to girls, and so that is why you get to hear what Assumpta is trying to bring to table, that you have ladies, especially children, young girls, who are brought into a home and are asked to have these many tasks without pay or consideration of their future. And so when you have such growing through time, their identity is attached to their work, and so you find that they find their value in marriage, or you find their value in, because these are things that society has painted as their identity. And so one of the biggest issues that this has brought on is a sense of worthlessness that has led to a lot of abuse of power, abuse of, there are so many women that have been scarred and wounded by the abuse, and later on in life they realize this is what life has dealt them, and this is the way it is. And the next generation they raise, because that is what they're going to do, is going to be raised in bitterness of this reality, and it is going to increase. If you have a young man growing up being raised by a woman with this kind of bitterness based on this abuse, he too is going to follow the suit, and he's going to say, this is how women are treated, this is how men are all these things, they're dogs, they're what. And I think that if we're to tackle this issue, it has to be a heart issue, one that addresses identity, one that addresses value and worth of everyone, but especially the women.
Thank you, Gideon. Let's take another short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. We're speaking today about unpaid care work, and I'm going to come to Assumpta first. Assumpta, what is the way forward? How do we promote co-responsibility of women and men in ensuring that the work of caregiving is everybody's responsibility and not just the responsibility of the woman or the girl in the home?
The way we can coexist, the woman and the man, in this unpaid work, is to ensure that we share responsibilities. I'll give you a living example. In the hotel setting, hotel sector, a chef, all chefs will go to the same school, but the female will be paid less. Even if she's the executive chef, she'll be paid less compared to the male counterpart. This I know, because we do represent these workers. We look at their payrolls and we ask, why are we having these salary inequalities? Then they will tell you the woman is because You know, she'll need many days of maternity leave. She will need days of sick leave because of the sick child. So I think if the law does cover the women, the female, as much as it covers the male, then there will be that gender equality and ensure that that unpaid care. The man can also stay home and take care of his children, as Assumpta is in the office trying to make more money, or providing service, equal service as the other men.
I like that suggestion that you're giving. I'm just wondering if it's as simple as it being the law, because I know we have cultural beliefs. There are also religious beliefs. When we bring in the Bible, people have particular quotes they are going to pull out for you. So maybe, Gideon, you want to come in and share with us what is the way forward, since you clearly understand what the women are saying. What is the way forward for co-responsibility of care work?
First of all, let me make the statement, and a society is only as great as its family are. And I think that this whole talk on value and worth, particularly of women, it can only be dealt with from the level of family. And as church, let me speak from the church perspective. First of all, our belief system recognizes the flaw of humanity, the breakdown, like we are completely flawed, and there's nothing that we can do for ourselves to be better in ourselves. And so we need help from outside. That is why we believe that God came to deal with our heart issues through his son Jesus. Now, that having been said, for a church to address these issues, we tend to become very moralistic by telling men to do this and the other, and they can do it for a few. Even in my own experience, you for a few weeks you can see a man doing the mopping, doing the dishes, trying to do, but eventually they get back to their default setting, and unless the default setting is addressed, the heart issue, the issue where they value the other person more than themselves, where their life pattern is in accordance to who they claim their Lord is, their master. If it is Jesus, then washing feet of the disciples is a clear example that Jesus demonstrated what servanthood is, that you're going to go beyond yourself to care for the other without expecting pay, without expecting a reward from them, but because you're doing it because of the master who is running your so that is in the context of church. Now, if that happens, I imagine if you have 10, 20 homes in a community where fathers, the men are taking on the challenge of valuing their women, valuing their daughters in such a way that they raise their children knowing that they are valuable, they have equal rights, and their sons are going to be engaged in these domestic activities as well as the ladies are going to be. In that community, you're going to find a transformation such as never before.
Mercy, I'm going to come back to you because Assumpta had started on policy, and I want you to speak to that as well. Listening to what Gideon has said, I think that on top of policy, we also need the church coming on board. We need all these institutions to participate so that the message gets through. But when we're speaking about that, there are things that policy can change. Looking at, for example, Sweden, the number of days you're given for leave, for maternity leave, are split between you and your spouse, so that he's also able to ably contribute, whether he does or not, but at least the days are given. Are these things that would work for us? What do we need to do in terms of policy?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Josephine, just allow me quickly before I jump into policy to just highlight some of the other ring fence suggestions that I know that would really contribute to strengthening this conversation, but ultimately action. First of all, I think that we need to do better in capturing the value of unpaid care work, but also invest in having, studies that really reflect, especially time surveys that reflect, these inequalities as they present themselves at the bare minimum, because that ultimately is what will inform policy. I think we don't have enough data on the magnitude of unpaid care work and its implication on our political economy. I think it's something that would help policymakers to consider drafting policies that ultimately tackle the problem that we are speaking about. Now, coming to policies specifically, we have wonderful example of countries that have deliberately recognized and valued care work. Of course, you mentioned Sweden, but I also know countries like Uruguay have done great in recognizing that, yes, people need to be cared for, but then there has to be a certain level of value attached to care workers. And as such, they have had laws that propose a very good minimum wage for people that are working in the care sector. And as such, this has contributed significantly into improving the economy, but also really just seeing that that gender gap is reduced. So it doesn't take away the fact that you're going to do care work, but then at least there is a certain level of remuneration that comes with that. In our own, I know there's been a lot of debate around the minimum wage bill, and some of the corporates, even in my own circles, were pushing back on that situation. But I said, look, if I will not stop myself from having a domestic worker, but I pay my domestic worker significantly well, just like somebody would pay the secretary at work, because I am in one way or the other reducing that financial burden. I mean, one way or the other valuing her.
Okay, so we've lost Mercy, but what I'm going to do now is come back to Gideon, to you, and to Assumpta to make your closing remarks. And your closing remarks really in terms of looking at interventions that we can think about as a way of going forward. So Assumpta, I'm going to start with you.
The interventions I think that government should take and trickle down is the regulation of this sector. Just like my sister said, Uruguay has done it. Domestic workers are considered as workers, and they have a minimum wage. We look at South Africa. South Africa has done the same. That the unpaid, the care sector is well regulated. There's at least they're covered by the law. But here in Uganda, it's not the case. So I think the intervention would be in the regulation.
Thank you so much for your contribution to the conversation. I'm going to move on to Gideon. Gideon, what do we do for the care dependent groups? So the children, the elderly, the sick, what do we do for them to sustain their right to be cared for and have equal access to quality care options?
This is very close to the heart of the founder of the church, who is Christ Jesus, because these are the vulnerable groups that he really interacted with and commissioned people to care for. And it's not just Jesus, but when you look at the entire Jewish system, the tithe system was meant to care for these vulnerable people. And so, again, I'm speaking specifically from the church angle, because I know that, at least as of now, in Uganda, the church ought to be, or the religious sector, let me just call it that way, the religious sector, but in particular the church, is one of the most influential bodies that is going to address the people and their thoughts on this aspect. Because the policy makers and all these law makers come from families that have been influenced by a certain system. And so, from my point of view, if what the resounding message is in these system making mechanisms, if the resounding voice is the care for the vulnerable, for the elderly, for the children, for the widows, I think that it becomes a thing that is part of a culture, part of a society. And so out of that care, we get to have policies pushed. The more people we have that are transformed in their hearts and in their minds, the more we have an opportunity to push for policies that will govern our nation in view of the care of these vulnerable people. And so my appeal is to the religious systems, but especially the church, to do the very best they can in view of transforming lives and mindsets and teaching on the value and care of the vulnerable, particularly the women, children, the elderly, the widows.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gideon, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation. Mercy, I'm coming to you for your closing remarks as well. And in speaking, I'm going to give you the same question that I gave Gideon. What do we do for the care-dependent groups, so children, the elderly, the sick, basically the vulnerable, to sustain their right to be cared for and have equal access to quality care options? Consider that right now preschools are closed and we don't have, as far as I know, state-owned elderly homes. So what is the way forward?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, also from a civil society perspective, since that is the sector where I currently am, that there's need for investment, especially towards addressing inequalities at community level. Perhaps through awareness raising and also designing programs that really go to the root of opening the minds of people to these realities and for them to be able to be part of the change that we want to see in this area. But we also need to see the state bringing to life what they have committed to do, especially under the National Development Plan 2, where they recognize the value of unpaid care work and recognizing women as contributors. And so we want to see the state invest more resources in trying to reverse that, but also ensuring that we have policies that back what their commitments are in terms of recognition and value of unpaid care work. And ultimately, we have to also invest really in the infrastructure that will lessen the burden of care work, especially in the circumstances we're in now, looking at how COVID-19 is. We do not know how long we're going to battle this pandemic, but it really brings to reality the conversation that we're having about care work and the risks that it poses, especially where the caregivers in this circumstance are not very well remunerated and they do not even have the resources to sort of protect themselves in the circumstances. So it is something that we need to deeply reflect on as a country, as a community, as religious institutions, as the civil society sectors, so that it finds its place in the priority conversations that we have on and off media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercy, for your thoughts, and thank you, Gideon and Assumpta, for taking the time. I know we've had connection issues, but somehow we've managed to make it through this conversation, and I thank you all so much for your input. I hope it goes a long way in changing mindsets, but also enabling our leaders to think of policies that take us a step further in resolving this. Thank you so much for taking the time, and that brings us to the end of our show for tonight. Coming up is MTV Weekend Edition.